Right, so Keir Starmer is still falling over himself, it appears, in his pursuit of a humanitarian pause, instead of actually calling for a ceasefire. As you've been asked, what would it take for him to actually back a ceasefire? What are his red lines, even as some examples of Israeli atrocity are presented to him, and it appears that he doesn't have any, which is incredibly dangerous, an awful thing to say. This man that could be in power in the none too distant future saying to Israel, right now, they can do what they like, and he won't budge an inch on his chosen position, despite being out of kilter with not only the majority of the general public, but with the majority of his own party, as more and more members and Labour groups, councillors, add their voice to the growing list of people demanding a change in tack from Keir Starmer, even to the point calls for him to resign have now been made. Could anything make him shift his stance? Well, my first thought on this was the wind's changing, but that hasn't been the case on this, as it has on so many other issues. But at least one Labour member nails exactly what it would take, and it isn't something any of us, or even Labour members, could deliver. Right, so Keir Starmer is still refusing to back a ceasefire, even as calls for him to do so continue to increase. The latest example coming from Newham Borough Council, again Labour controlled, where more than half of the ruling Labour group and the mayor there have demanded an immediate ceasefire, diplomacy for lasting peace and freedom and justice for Gaza. They've written to Starmer saying, as Newham Labour Mayor and Councillors, we are proud to represent one of the most diverse communities in the country. We are appalled and saddened by the events in the Middle East. Some of us have been personally touched by the war. Some of us will represent residents whose lives have been thrown into turmoil and chaos, or will watch on in horror. As community leaders, it is incumbent on us to demonstrate our commitment to humanity in the face of horror. We must stand with our community in the face of racism, whether that be anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. We must oppose all acts of murder and hostage-taking. We stand against collective punishment and killing of vulnerable people, especially in hospitals and places of sanctuary. We call for the following actions. We join many other Labour councillors and council leaders, MPs, Labour shadow ministers, London Mayor Sadiq Khan, Sir Stephen Timms MP and others in calling for an immediate ceasefire. We join the UN Secretary-General's call for an end to the blockade of medical supplies and much-needed aid. We call for the release of all illegally held prisoners and hostages. We call for international and human rights laws to be upheld, particularly with regards to the illegal occupation of both Gaza and the West Bank. We call for an immediate diplomatic solution to be found through peace talks and agreements. Who can argue with that? None of us can argue with that, surely, but Starmer apparently can. Well, he's raised his head above the parapet in order to attend the North East Chamber of Commerce to talk about Labour's economic vision for the country. Totally different tack, getting away from all of this Israel mess that he's made for himself, but having invited questions at the end of his speech, inevitably his stance regarding Gaza and Israel still came up. We're at the point now that because of his ardent support for Israel, despite the atrocities they are blatantly committing on a daily basis now, obviously now, he cannot escape being questioned on his position of a humanitarian pause instead of a ceasefire, a position that basically allows aid into Gaza as long as bombing can resume straight away again afterwards. In light of this position, Starmer was asked a question following yet another dry as tinder speech, as all of his are, but he was asked by one questioner on this situation in Gaza, what would your red lines be? There's been accusations of white phosphorus being used, of collective punishment, of bombing of safe routes. What are your red lines when it comes to Israel's behaviour? It's a good question, put in the context that was laid before him, put him on the spot, make him criticise Israel for something. We know white phosphorus is being used. Human rights groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have reported that to be true. And in addition to that, we've seen video footage all over social media of white phosphorus munitions falling from the sky and hitting the ground, with Palestinians hurriedly running out with buckets of dirt and spades with which to smother the vapours, which are noxious, and the phosphorus itself, which can burn down to the bone. The stuff is illegal to use in civilian areas where it can leave people with crippling lifelong injuries. It is a blatant breach of international law that Israel are using it somewhere as densely populated as the Gaza Strip. Not that they've shown any concerns for civilians so far in their pursuit of Hamas hitting churches, mosques, those safe routes of travel south where Israel have directed Gazans to go, of course, along with targeting the south too while they've got there. They've hit refugee camps, and as of yesterday, having targeted the entrances of a further 3 hospitals on top of the one they've already bombed, entrances where refugees had gathered, hundreds dead, in what can only be seen as deliberate targeting of civilians to my mind. But back to Starmer. He had to answer this question. What would his red lines be? He said, well, I set out my position clearly on Tuesday, and what we're seeing is the worst terrorist attack on Israel since the Holocaust, and a humanitarian crisis that was already in existence in Gaza, which has claimed far too many innocent lives already. We have to alleviate that. At the moment, the only practical way to do that is with humanitarian pauses. To say to a sovereign country, when 200 of its civilians are being held hostage, that they must give up their right to self-defence, is not, for me, the correct position. And anyone who has watched the images of the last 2 or 3 days have seen precisely what Hamas are saying about this. So what we have to concentrate on is the need of these innocent individuals who are caught up in this. The children, the young people, the civilians in Gaza, those in Israel who are subject to still being subject to attacks through rockets. And I have to say, humanitarian pauses to get that aid in and alleviate the situation. I think our focus should be on those who most desperately need our support and help, not on political voices in our own country. So, did you hear him mention red lines and what they'd be then? Nope. Apparently he doesn't have any. Swerved it entirely. Israel apparently can do what they like because Hamas have got 200 hostages. Or do they? Because Israel isn't really trying to rescue them very hard. Not when they are literally levelling everything in front of them. There have been reports of some of these hostages having been killed amongst the thousands of Gazan civilians who are now dead, who don't warrant a mention from Starmer. And besides which, all these attacks, which Starmer calls self-defence, by the way, it is Israel bombing Gaza here, you Zionist shill. That's offence, not defence. You're excusing war crimes and won't draw a red line anywhere on that issue. He said this is the worst violence seen in Israel since the Holocaust, which, being the first thing he said, should have set alarm bells off that this was a guy without an actual Scooby of what he was talking about, since the Holocaust was a genocide of European Jews for a start, and that it took place between 1941 and 1945, when the State of Israel wasn't actually created until 1948. He spoke of aid and the need to get it to those who most need it. Children. Social media is awash with images of kids, dead babies right now, intensely graphic stuff, which people need to see, I believe, because we are so insulated in the West against such imagery as a rule. Things are so bad out there that we need to see these to wake up. Now that medical staff in hospitals have got a new acronym for infant patients. I don't know if you've heard about this one. Their new acronym, WCNSF, which stands for Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Given the young age of the majority of Gazans, though, having suffered decades of oppression under blockade, 50% of the population are under 18. I'm surprised they haven't had this acronym already. How awful a thought is that, though? Starmer lacks conviction. He lacks morals in his staunch belief of Israel's right to defend itself, ignoring that same right to innocent Palestinians living under occupation when Israel is literally the occupier. It's just endorsement for them to commit further war crimes. As far as he is concerned, Israel can do what it wants with impunity, as long as a US-backed plan for a pause to let them have some food before they get bombed again is permitted. That's enough to satiate what passes for Keir Starmer's soul. Not mine. As long as some aid gets in now and again, that the Gazans get a small breather periodically, Israel can do what it likes after. It's twisted. It's messed up. What do you call it when the bombing starts again then? As I said at the start though, there's more to it than that. We have all manner of these Labour figures, members, councillors around the country calling for a ceasefire, a cessation of the hostilities and peace talks to follow, not a breather for aid followed by more bombing. Roughly a third of his own MPs have now publicly called for a ceasefire, Labour MPs. The rest are still kissing his backside. However, one Labour MP has apparently told ITV News' Shihab Khan something that probably sums the situation up as accurately as anything right now within the Labour Party. Because they've gone to him and they've told him that there's no point Starmer trying to convince people that humanitarian pauses are the answer when he will literally be arguing for a new position as soon as Biden and Sunak announce one. And isn't that the truth of the matter? Starmer is not a leader. He is led by the Israel lobby who fund him, led by the US, just like his idol Tony Blair was, and we all saw what that led to. Imagine what he would be doing right now if he was in power. And of course the Tories and Sunak are currently saying all the same things, because they said it before him, and Starmer has just adopted what they've said. But the moment Sunak might shift towards ceasefire, you can guarantee Starmer would as well. Not only to neuter Tory criticism of him since he's riding high in the polls still, or rather Labour is. Starmer's personal polling is absolutely awful. People will still vote Labour despite him to get the Tories out. But when he just does what they say, when Labour policy continues to be dictated by the Tories and what is voting Labour going to achieve then in getting the Tories out, when the Labour Party just says what the Tories are going to anyway? And what does it say about us as a society if we're prepared to vote in one pro-Israel war crimes backing excuser for another? The calls for him to go must grow. He's dangerously incapable of leading this country. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Do also have your say on this video in the comments below and be part of the conversation. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where Starmer's patheticness is unfortunately being replicated elsewhere as well, with France now pushing for legislation to make calling out Israeli apartheid illegal. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.